What is time? How do you perceive it? What kind of role it plays in a bar or in a restaurant? Well, to me, going to bars and restaurants is always about experience. It's almost like a theater. And every great piece of theater has some start and introduction. It has the build-up and the drama and some sort of conclusion. So I felt I'm going to invite for this 3 of my favorite people who are very good at crafting those experiences and who use time as a very important element of their work. I would love to grab Martin, first of all, because his perspective is really unique. So what is time to you? What is the role of time, Martin, and how do you perceive it?
Well, I think if the theme is time and design, a big part of the question is like, what is design? And what is design today versus what it was 20 years ago? And I think today design really is an expression of intent. It's not design of objects anymore. It's really about crafting experiences or transforming experiences. And time then becomes an active ingredient. Like I think we've all experienced this transformation, or we've lived this transformation of a society from material to experiential, where objects have completely transformed in a way we interact with them in the role that they play in our lives. It's no longer about the object's presence, it's about the object's role in an experience in our lives. So it's not a thing that we put on a shelf, it really is a thing that's active, that we interact with, that we use all the time. So in a way, design is transforming into designing experiences, as Alex mentioned. And then if we're in a setting discussing, the future trends or like where is the bar world going, I feel that looking at the role of time, it means time is an active ingredient, both on the side of the user, basically the person experiencing, as well as on the preparation side. So on the preparation side, as a designer, I experience a lot of pressure, like how do we improve efficiency? It's a big question. Like how do we save time? While at the same time, it's looking at what is the quality of the time that the guest is experiencing. It's a really interesting friction. So then it's looking at the object and what is actually, or not the object, but the experiential components, the vessels, the vehicles, the space, the menus, like what is actually the qualitative component there. And then that comes into play as we look at the experience as a whole. It's the entire, and Alex touched on this as well, like the entire experience is a composition. It's one composition from start to finish, from the first time you even think about a place to the point where you leave it, and what do you retain? How did you experience this from the point of entering the space, ordering, interacting with the drinks, and then retaining some component that's become extremely personal because it's only yours. Like there's nothing, experience is one of those things, just like time you can only give, experience you can only retain. Like there's no way of sharing it. If anything, sharing generally really is detrimental to an experience. And I think one component that we see a lot, again, is participation. Like, the participatory element is what makes it personal, what makes it personable. It's basically looking at the various components and utensils, vessels, vehicles. Like, how do they become participatory? How do you become a witness in an active fashion where it's not a passive experience, it's an active experience?
Where do you get involved? Because I think that's a thing which has changed a lot in the industry, because I think designers now get involved at a very different stage than they perhaps used to do 20 years ago.
What I think, if we start to think about design as an expression of intent, like when does the intent begin? And so I think it really starts before, it should really start as early on in the process as possible. And one thing about designing for an experience or trying to express an intent is that it's not a discipline. It's not disciplinary. Like my role as a designer is very specific in a way, just like the bartenders. But ultimately what crafts the experience is the collaboration between the back of the house, the front of the house, the person that's creating the physical objects that are going to be used. And I think what's changed the most is the fact that you really, that collaboration has become critical to the process, because there's not a single skill set that will answer to all of those components in the experience. So you really need to engage everybody as early on in the process as possible. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, because I know, I'm leading on to my next question, because Martin has actually created the platter for Bocuse d'Or. Bocuse d'Or is the biggest culinary chef competition in the world. Takes every year place in Lyon, early January, is it?
Yeah, early other year, yep.
And January, February. And Martin collaborated with the American team on the service platter. So perhaps, do you want to tell us about what was the journey, when did you get involved, and how did it change?
I think that's actually a really good illustration of the transformation that we're talking about, because it started originally as designing a platter. It's a very passive thing where, you know, the goal was to design a platter that will hold the food, be paraded in front of the jury, and then be carried back, and the food will be portioned. But once we started spending time in the kitchen together, we realized that a lot of the tools that we use in the design process are tools that can be used in the kitchen as well. Because we make lots of tools, we make lots of jigs, we make lots of cutters and molds. And once we started to apply all the knowledge we had from in our discipline to the kitchen, we realized that we can really improve the efficiency on the kitchen side. They can articulate the food better, and they can reduce the amount of time that's spent. So all of a sudden they were able to reduce 9 hours of kitchen time into 5 hours of kitchen time just by modifying the tools that they were using. And I think that's something that is only possible when the collaboration starts really early on, when you can basically focus on the end result in a proactive way rather than a reactive way.
If there's one person who prepares a lot, that's Ryan in my eyes. He based the entire concept of preparation, and as Martin says, it's one of the things which is very discussed in the industry right now. Mm-hmm. So how do you see yourself, how do you perceive yourself in the terms of preparation, the importance of it, why?
Well, I think it's always got to be about a balance, and I think, actually to preempt, I think there's going to be a couple of points that we're all going to echo across here. And that idea of being involved very, very early on in the process and trying to understand as many and control as many aspects of it, I think is kind of a crucial point of the way modern food and drink and hospitality is put together. But I think one of the things that really interested me, and I presume all of us when we began this discussion, was really looking at the kind of duality of it. It's this idea of concept and it's this idea of practicality. And the kind of drink I wanted to, actually I suppose it's worth even, I presume you've all picked up and held one of the porthole things, the infusions. Okay. So one of the things that I really loved about this was it's an object, or as a tool, as Martin described it, as something that really brought those two things together, practicality and this concept. And so talking about time, it became really, really exciting. And I think it's something that, you know, it has become the new luxury. It's the thing we're all trying to kind of present and kind of channel. And, you know, even just the idea of getting together so many lovely friends in one room is a rarity now, and it is something to be celebrated. So the idea of, and I know Monica's going to talk a bit about the experience more on that, but the idea of kind of trying to channel this idea of time in these different ways was really exciting to discuss with all of you today. And I think one of the things that it's really reflective of our industry, not only in this experiential side, but it's really what booze is about. This idea of time is you know, in one sense, alcohol is preservative. It's a way of kind of carrying things through. It's always been linked to this concept of time, and I think it's a really nice thing to try and really demonstrate rather than just simply kind of talk about an abstraction or kind of allude to. So with the idea of these infusers as a way of kind of giving that time to somebody was lovely, but really from a practical side, it's something that, you know, we in the bars try and work a lot on. And from experience in kitchens, it's something that has become very kind of paramount to the way I approach drinks and look at drinks and try and incorporate it into what we offer. And so within White Lion, I think it's probably the best way of describing it, because it's kind of the whole concept of bringing everything back and trying to look at not necessarily the idea of how things transform, but the idea of kind of preparation, the idea of what are you doing with your time beforehand, how do you give that time back to a guest in the bar. And it's a big part of what we did was try to understand, if we took away that time aspect from being in front of the guest, how could we give that time, how can we sell that kind of real commodity to people in a slightly different way. And it's something I've tried to do with the drink we've done here. It's obviously slightly different to what we do at White Line. You've got some lovely fresh ingredients in there as well on display. But it's a drink, I've called it Time the Healer as well. So I've given the drink a name, and it's really based upon really this idea of those 2 points, the kind of concept of time and the idea of the practicality of the execution of it. So it's quite nicely poured in front of you now. You don't need to worry about the kind of preparations. It's something you get to experience on the spot. And it's really looking at this, well, both idea of time in terms of the concept, but alcohol in terms of summing up the time. So I've used the cognac as the base, which to me was always a spirit that really tried to demonstrate time. It's a product that's all on the blending. It's all about trying to encapsulate something, demonstrate the raw material, but do so in a way that's giving time back to the consumer. And I've done a little bit of a playful thing on this as well. There's some quartz stones in there as well. Time being the kind of ethereal thing that nobody's really kind of had a grasp on. In a practical sense, quartz was used as an electricity regulator in watches. It's also been used in a slightly more pseudoscience-y kind of way, as a way of channeling inner energies, all those ideas of kind of the spiritual side of crystals, and the idea of time in this essence of it. So what I've tried to do is kind of pull of these elements together, so you've got a little bit of the conceptual side, as the porthole infuser kind of represents, but you've got something that's practically executed as well. The drink has had an infusion, it's covered a period of time, and it's taken on certain flavors. So some really little accents in there. There's some Pinot de Charente, there's some strawberry and sage, a little bit of absinthe, but a really, really simple drink that's executed through the practicality of it, but then also reflects this idea of the more ethereal time aspect as well.
Taking time into consideration, one of the most crucial things are timing, because you have to think about your timing. When is something being served, when, by whom, where, why? All these things have to kind of be right, because you've all maybe went to a restaurant or bar where the timing has just been perfect, and you walk away and you kind of think, wow, I understand every single thing that you do, but still you're kind of blown away because just the timing is perfect.
Is there a difference when you work with the bartenders and the chefs?
I don't really see a significant difference. Like, I think there's, the mentality is very much the same, at least, at the level that the people operate at that I work with. So I don't know that I really perceive, especially as time evolves, I feel like there's more of a shift in the bar world towards kind of the level of refinement and precision that has existed in the culinary world for a while. So I think that the scene is changing a little bit, and they're coming closer together, definitely. And I feel like there's, like in the culinary world, there's one thing that we've, like over the last 12 years, we've looked at and thought about a lot, which is kind of eliminating extraneous components. Looking at, like, how do we reduce the number of steps, or what is really necessary? Like how do you take a tool and make it work from start to finish, from preparation to consumption? And it's something where, like, the porthole comes into play because it does a very similar thing in the bar setting or in a lounge setting. But it's, I think that's one idea that's that permeates everything. It's kind of like, how do we eliminate these points of transition, like where the transformation is not necessarily required by the process, by the desired end result. But to simply answer the question, I see the difference between the culinary world and the bar world kind of closing the gap.
With all the talk about streamlining the process and making it as efficient as possible, I suppose there's probably something to be said sometimes for having to wait a bit, because I'm sure flavour science will tell us that actually enhances your appreciation of things sometimes. I guess the ritual of an old-fashioned or something like that, having to wait a little bit.
Well, I think silence is a big part of a composition, right? Like, the silence is an active ingredient as well. So a pause should be thought of with the same amount of weight as the busy part. So I think that it's very valid. Like, it absolutely should be considered a very important part.
If your main course comes too quickly after your
right, exactly. And I think like in a tasting format in a restaurant, it's often considered, like sequence of flavors, sequence of textures, and the time in between them, because it, certain flavors are intended to evolve over a period of time and transform whereas others are intended to just be a palate cleanser or a very brief break. So I think that the downtime is definitely something that ought to be actively thought of.
And I think whatever I seek in those settings, I look for the consideration. I want to understand that people have thought about where what I'm experiencing in that. So in the same way, I'm not, I know that if I order the lamb that's cooked for 24 hours, I'm not waiting 24 hours for it, but I want to feel that experience of it. And in the same way, if people do think about my pacing in a restaurant or in a bar, that it feels like it's been thought about is what and that aspect of time I don't think needs to be. I think it goes back to that idea of the weight of the pause and all of those things, but I think it's just the fact that it's taken into account is what makes it valuable.
I also think that someone that's on their phone or playing a game or texting can enjoy the experience equally as someone who is sitting in front of you, video filming you making the cocktails. Yeah. It's all about how they perceive the experience and how interested they are. Because, I mean, a lot of my friends that's not in the industry, they enjoy going to bars and having drinks or catch up, but they have no interest in seeing how a cocktail is made. I mean, some of them, when they buy spirits or wine in the store, it's like, oh, I like this label. I'm gonna take this one. So it's a different approach to how you spend your time, but just the fact that they're all willing to come and spend the time at your bar, which is kind of the enjoyable for us, I would say, as a bartender.
What we try to do from my perspective is we're trying to, as bad as it might sound, control or drive behavior in a certain direction. Like the little glasses, they're tasting glasses, they're unstable. You're supposed to perceive them as unstable, and they only hold small amount of volume, so you taste small amounts frequently rather than do a big pour and drink it and nurse it all night. So we're trying to basically employ little things that will make it feel natural and that will not require instruction. It's like, how do you gently nudge people towards the way you intend this experience to be consumed? It's not about telling people, don't pour that much. It's just basically you control the experience by giving them the right tools. Because ultimately time is about presence, it's about memory, it's about awareness. And if we just let it all fall apart and disassemble and be drawn in 5 directions, you're not really anywhere.
There's times and places where you want to be challenged, other times you don't. And I think going back to that idea of consideration, some things become the kind of opposite of that, where you're actually doing it for the sake of it. So, serving every burger on a board, and it just becomes frustrating because it's so obviously not considered. But I think I tend to find those things more frustrating than being in a particularly avant-garde restaurant and having a very different delivery method, because I buy into that and you can tell that it's done for the right reasons. It's not done for pretentiousness or gimmick. It's part of that whole proposition. So I think it's very kind of contextual dependent, in my experience anyway.
I think part of it is like, do you want to stop a conversation, or do you want to become a part of a conversation, or do you want to be a backdrop to a conversation? And I think that's, like in this case, clearly this is not something it's intended to stop the conversation and bring the focus to the bite. And that's why it is, in a way, disruptive in its appearance and in its utility. So you do focus on it, and you will handle it gingerly. So you do focus on that small bite. But other times you don't. That's not the goal, and so you completely change. You use tools that are just so familiar that you don't even employ your brain. You just kind of go through with it. But it will not most likely be memorable. What will be memorable is, if anything, the other context.
Do you want to introduce some of your pieces?
This I call a peacock. It was intended as like fireworks of flavor, kind of always to finish a meal, where like I was just mentioning, like you're trying to just kind of bring the conversation to this very last bite that should be intensely flavored, but not sate the guest anymore. But yeah, I feel like that's kind of redundant. So, in the case of like introducing the pieces, we're here. We don't have time for that.